Under the pale shimmer of a sleepless moon, the river wore a cloak of mist. Shadows huddled along the banks, and silence pressed against the world like a blanket of sorrow. Out of that silence walked a young mother. Her steps were heavy, as though each one carried the weight of judgment from every pair of eyes in the village. She was hollow from hunger, worn thin from whispers, and bent low beneath the shame pressed upon her shoulders. In her arms she carried not hope, but a woven straw basket wrapped in cloth. Inside lay her newborn twins, their chests rising and falling with quiet innocence. The young woman stopped at the edge of the current. Her hands trembled as if the river itself were tugging at her wrists. Biting her lips until they bled, she whispered words into the night. "Let the waters take what life refused to welcome." Her voice cracked like dry firewood. She lowered the basket into the pulling current, her tears meeting the river's surface. Within moments, the straw cradle drifted away, bobbing between reeds and roots, carrying not only two fragile lives but the echoes of a broken heart. Then the mother turned and melted into the fog, believing she had ended a chapter that never should have begun. But the river was not finished. Dawn crept across the horizon, gentle as a prayer. Roosters crowed. Mist rolled over the fields like a sheet pulled over sleeping earth. And from his hut, an old fisherman named Joe shuffled toward the water. Joe was well known among the villagers, though not for fish. His nets rarely carried more than river grass, and his hooks came back bare. Children teased, men scoffed, and women shook their heads. "Joe fishes for wind," they said, "not for food." Yet this same man, mocked for his empty pots, carried something they could not see, an unshakable bond with the river, as though he spoke to it like an old companion. That particular morning, Joe's chest felt unsettled. It was not pain. It was not joy. It was a heavy ache, the kind that arrives without reason but demands to be carried. He set down his faded stool at the bank, dipped his cracked feet into the cool water, whispered his daily prayer, "Oala Gijimi," and cast his fishing line. But before hook and water could even meet, he caught something else with his eyes. There, half hidden in roots and reeds, a basket rocked gently against the current. At first, it looked like nothing more than a farmer's container for corn or damp cloth. But as Joe narrowed his eyes, he saw a covering laid across it, and then heard it, the faintest sound, the soft cry of something too alive to ignore. His heart thundered. His hands shook, not from fear, but from instinct. Slowly, Joe waded forward. With care, he pulled the basket free as if retrieving a secret from the bottom of the world. When he folded back the damp cloth, he gasped and wept all at once. Two babies, twins, slept inside, curled against one another, identical as mirrored flames. Fragile yet breathing, wrapped not in riches but in the mercy of survival itself. Their skin was warm. Their breaths were true. The cloth smelled faintly of dried milk. These were not accidents. This was an answer. Joe did not speak. He simply knelt there in awe, staring at the delicate miracle until silence became unbearable. Then he lifted them, one against each side of his chest, his arms trembling beneath responsibility, yet steady beneath purpose. The river murmured behind him, its current carrying on, but destiny had shifted direction. He did not run home in panic. He marched slowly, solemnly, like part of a holy procession. Each step seemed to be witnessed, the heron rising off the water, the falling leaf spinning between shadows, the soft hiss of wind through the trees. Joe didn't know where these boys had begun, but he knew exactly where they belonged, from that moment forward, in the shelter of his heart. At the edge of the village, a woman sweeping her yard froze mid-motion, broom falling from her grasp. Joe came walking with something no one had ever seen in his arms, two babies balanced firmly against his shoulders. Words failed her, but whispers rose behind every wall. Curiosity oozed from cracked door frames and backyards. Yet Joe held no fear. He had walked beneath mocking stares for years, but never before had he walked with such certainty. "Joe!" someone barked with sharp humor from the village gate. "Did you go to fish, or to catch children?" Without breaking stride, Joe answered. Calmly, his tone steady as a man who carried more truth than he revealed. "I didn't catch tilapia. I caught destiny." And with that, he entered his house, a clay and wood shelter that had known poverty but would now know something richer. He lit a small lamp, spread a mat from corner to corner, and laid the children side by side. Kneeling, he whispered, "I don't know who you are, but from this moment on, no one will ever call you unwanted in this world." His house had never known finery, never shone with riches. Yet that night, even the poorest lamp seemed to burst with a glow no flame could produce, the glow of love claiming its place without hesitation. So it was that Joe, the fisherman mocked for pots always empty, stumbled home with arms full, not of fish, but of two miracles. And his story, like the smoke of firewood curling into dusk, began to spread. By the time the twins slept peacefully across the straw mat, the village itself buzzed like a storm about to break. Tongues wagged at market stalls, voices carried at wells, gossip walked faster than feet. "Did you hear? Joe, who never caught a single thing, returned from the river with babies." No one had seen their mother. No one had seen a birth. All they knew was that two children floated from the water and landed in the arms of a man who once had nothing. "Whose children are they?" the women whispered, shocked and thrilled all at once. "And he means to raise them himself?" The men muttered, amused at the madness of it. "There is something strange here," said the elder, face wrinkling with suspicion. Still, no one offered friendship. No one offered hands. It was easier to invent sin than to recognize a miracle, easier to gossip than to give help. And so while they spoke, Joe simply cared. His mortar pounded yam. His water boiled with guava leaves. He found ways to fashion feeding bottles out of gourds, ropes, and faith. At night he sang them lullabies his grandmother once hummed, a quiet chant of battles and courage. "Sleep, children of the waters. The world is hard, but one day your hearts will be stronger than stone." In the mornings, he swaddled them against his old shoulders and walked the market square. Curious villagers clustered beneath the mango tree to gawk and sneer. "Are those your sons, Joe?" someone asked mockingly. Adjusting the cloth that held them close against him, Joe replied with dignity, "They came from the water, and they will be raised with honor." Laughter rippled through the crowd, harsh and cruel, like crows chasing a dove. But not everyone laughed. Some stood silent, their eyes following as if held still by an unfamiliar weight. Love can silence the tongue even when pride refuses to admit it. Weeks stretched into months. The twins grew strong, one marked by a tiny scar on his forehead, the other by a dimple deep in his cheek. Joe chose names not from memory but from instinct, as though the river itself had whispered them. Solano and Zaya. From morning to night, his hands tilled cassava, his rod lay across the water, and his voice poured stories into their ears, tales of speaking fish, walking forests, and mothers, remembered in the marrow, even when absent. At the harvest festival, while drums pounded and villagers danced in circles, the twins clapped their little hands and wriggled in joy, tumbling into the circle themselves. Every laugh and every beat carried their small steps higher. There, watching intently, stood Dandara, the healer. Her eyes burned with a vision others could not see. She touched Solano's brow, then Zaya's dimple, her lips uttering words steady as prophecy. These boys were not born to carry shame. They were sent to heal, and their healing will go deeper than wounds. They will touch the shame buried inside every heart. None fully understood her words, but no one forgot them. The village that once mocked began to divide. Some clung still to suspicion, while others stood quieter, more respectful, sensing a strange light in the boys' smiles. One morning, a brash young boy asked Joe plainly, "You have no wife, and those boys aren't your blood. Why would you raise them?" Joe looked directly into his eyes, years of struggle carved into his weathered face. His answer came like a river flowing straight from the soul. "Because when the world lets go, God gathers. And sometimes he gathers in the house of the least expected." The boy said nothing, and for the first time didn't run off to tell the others. He went home and slept with that truth resting quietly in his chest. Back then, in that land, a name meant more than an action. But there, in that clay house under the cashew tree, two boys were learning that love doesn't need a surname. And the village was beginning slowly and often reluctantly to realize that dignity isn't born from blood. It's born from choice. Dandara wasn't the kind of woman who showed up without a reason. She walked barefoot with steady steps and a silence heavier than any speech. Her hands were always full of leaves and wisdom, and her mouth, even when closed, held prayers passed down through generations. She was the eldest in the village, and also the most feared. Not because she caused harm, but because she saw what others pretended not to. She heard about the twins just like everyone else. But unlike the others, she didn't run to whisper. She ran to observe. One sweltering evening she passed by Joe's house without a word. She stopped at the crooked wooden gate and watched the boys playing on the dirt floor. One was drawing in the dust with a stick. The other laughed to himself as if talking to something invisible. Joe saw her and opened the door. Surprised, Dandara wasn't one to make visits. "Good afternoon, Mother. Would you like to come in?" She didn't reply. She simply stepped forward, knelt down in front of the boys and placed a hand on each of their heads. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath like someone who listens beyond sound. These two, they weren't born just to grow up. They're going to heal, but not broken arms. They're going to heal shame. They'll cleanse names stained by things that weren't their fault. Joe swallowed hard. No one had ever spoken of the boys that way before. It was always judgment, suspicion, jokes. But there, in Therapy voice of that old woman who seemed to carry centuries on her shoulders, there was recognition, not just of the boys, but of him too. Dandara stood with some effort, wiped her hands on her skirt, and said, "He'll come back tomorrow. I'll bring mango leaf tea to calm their sleep, and a blessing to keep away the evil eye. There are people in this village who throw poison with just a glance, even at children." And she came back the next day. And the day after that, and again she started bringing teas, roots, and stories from before the beginning of time. She told of mothers who cried inside trees, of fathers who turned to stone from too much regret, and of children born with the gift of turning pain into hope. And the twins listened to it all. Even so young, they paid attention, as if the world was being drawn right before them. Jobo listened too, and he heard more than just words. He heard advice hidden in proverbs, like when Dandara said, "Those who plant in fear, harvest in anger. Raise them with a firm hand, Jew, but a light heart. These boys won't grow up pied. They'll give back to the world what the world stole from them." That night, Jew sat by the door, looking at the sky. The moon was full, and the wind blew as if sweeping away the remnants of a past that wasn't his. He thought about everything Dandara had said. He thought about the boy's mother, where she might be, if she still remembered them, if she still cried. But as he looked at the two of them sleeping, curled up together, he knew it didn't matter. Not anymore. From that moment on, he wouldn't raise orphans. He would raise men with names, direction, and dignity. Dandara kept coming. She brought healing in her hands and strength in her words. When someone in the village asked why she got so involved with the fisherman's boys, she answered, Simply, some souls recognize from afar, and some missions choose us, even when we don't want them. Once she left a necklace of red seeds at Joe's store and said, "Put this around their necks when they go out. Some people smile but spit venom through their eyes." Joe Bow did as told. And so, with roots, prayers, and quiet courage, the twins grew, up surrounded by a force they didn't fully understand but deeply felt, because Dandara wasn't just a healer. She was a guardian, and she had chosen to protect not just the boys' bodies, but their souls. Those two boys who once floated down the river and were now slowly anchoring themselves in the heart of the village, one gesture at a time. Faith there didn't come from books. It came from action. From a glance, from a shared pot, an extended hand, a silence that heals. And it was in that silence that Dandara left her mark. She didn't write history, but she shaped destiny with leaves, faith, and presence. Time passed with quiet but steady steps. The cashew trees began to bloom. The boys were starting to form their first words, and Joe remained steadfast like a mountain's, in the middle of a storm. His house, once silent, now breathed life. The twins' laughter mixed with the smell of porridge on the fire. And though the routine was tough, it was wrapped in tenderness. But far from there, along dusty trails and unspoken secrets, another story was moving. Silent, trembling, full of shame. The mother, the woman who had once knelt by the river and released 2 baskets of flesh and soul, without looking back now, lived with the weight of that decision clinging to her back. She had moved to a far-off village, working as a washerwoman. In other people's homes, sleeping on a rented mat, hiding her face beneath a scarf like someone trying to erase the past. But inside, the past called to her every day. It called her by the names she no longer dared to speak her son's names. She told herself she did what she had to, that no one helped her, that she was alone, that the river was more merciful than the village. But none of those words silenced the sobs that came in the middle of the night, when she saw in dreams 2 identical little faces floating on a river that didn't carry it returned. It was on an ordinary afternoon when the sky threatened. Rain and the drums of the harvest festival echoed all the way to the neighboring village that she decided to return. She didn't know why. She just knew she needed to see, not speak, not touch, just see. She covered her face with the same old scarf, now even more faded, and walked the path back as if heading to her own trial. Every step hurt, not her feet, but her memory. When she saw the first huts of the village, her heart pounded like a drum. The wind seemed to recognize her scent. The trees whispered as if asking, "Is it you?" She hid behind a thick bush. Near Joe's house, she didn't need to get closer. From the yard she could see them, the 2 boys sitting on the ground eating fruit and playing with a small goat. The same wide smile, the same sparkle in their eyes. One would grab the fruit and share it with the other. Neither cried, neither looked like they lacked anything. That's when her legs gave out. She dropped to her knees silently, covered her mouth with both hands so she wouldn't scream. Her chest was a drum of regret, and the tears came as if they were trying to wash away the entire story. She wanted to run to them, say, "It's me." But shame was stronger than instinct, and the same voice that once whispered, "Let the water take what life didn't want," now said softly in despair, "I wanted them. I just couldn't." She stayed there long, enough to see one of the boys fall and the other help him up, and then both running inside the house laughing. And Joe, "Slow down, my sons. The ground teaches, but love supports." That phrase made her get up. She couldn't take any more. What she saw was more than she could bear. Not because it hurt to see her sons doing well, but because of exactly that, they were well, and she didn't feel worthy of any of it. She ran. Not out of fear of being seen, but out of guilt from seeing herself. When she arrived back in the village where she lived, she spoke to no one. She washed clothes like always, swept the yard like always, slept on the mat like always. But something inside her had torn, a tear that can't be stitched with time, only with courage. And that day she realized something she may never have admitted before. It wasn't that she didn't want to be a mother. It was that the world hadn't let her. And now the one who paid for it was the silence inside her. A silence that day after day asked for forgiveness, without saying a word. And the village, never knew she'd been there. Never knew that behind a bush a broken soul had watched the fruit she planted in desperation, and understood that even from afar she was still the root. The only witness to that moment was the wind. And the wind as always carried the pain away, but left behind the lesson. Not all abandonment is lack of love. Sometimes it's just a scream without an echo. And those who scream, even in silence, still hope Toby heard. It was on an unassuming morning, one of those days that starts like any other, but carries questions that change everything. The sky was clear, the pot on the fire simmered a simple porridge, and Joe, sitting on the porch, was weaving an old fishing net while the boys played, chasing a stubborn chicken. Their laughter was light, but in between giggles came the question Joe had always known would arrive. He just didn't know when. Dosetsu stopped running, looked at his brother with a curious glance, then turned to the old fisherman. "Papa Joe, why don't we have a mom?" The silence that followed was heavier than any soaked fishing net. Yu felt his chest tighten, his hands froze, mid-knot, and his eyes blurred like a cloud had drifted into the room. He had known this moment would come, but knowing doesn't prepare you for the sting of a question born from a clean, innocent heart. Solano came closer to the two of them, stood in front of him waiting for an answer, like farmers waiting for rain after a drought. Duju took a deep breath. He didn't lie, but he also didn't deliver the pain in raw words. With a soft voice, like someone telling a secret to the wind, he said, "A mother is someone who feeds your spirit. Even from far away, you have one." The boys didn't understand everything, but they felt it. They felt the weight of the answer not in their ears but on their skin. They stayed quiet as if digesting something deeper than words. That night, after the two of them fell asleep, curled up together like little birds in a nest, Joe sat on the porch in the dark, the lamp glowing faintly and his heart in pieces. He cried. Not with sobs, but with those tears that flow from the inside out. Not out of force, but out of truth. He thought of their mother, of the basket on the riverbank, of the smell of the river that morning, of her eyes behind the bush. Months earlier he knew he had felt it. He knew she loved them. But her love had come mixed with fear, with abandonment, with despair. And he, a man who had never had children of his own, had become a father to two boys, asking about a mother they might never truly have. The next morning, Joe did something he had never done. He went to the back of the yard where the weeds grew, freely, and dug two holes side by side. He took two cashew seeds he'd been saving for a long time, washed them with water from the pot, and planted one in each hole. Then he called the boys, still sleepy-eyed. "These cashew trees are your billy buttons, one for each of you, because even those who don't know where they come from still need roots." Zeka touched the soft earth. Solano looked at the seed like it held a mystery. Yo crouched between them and said, "We don't choose where we come from, but we can choose where we're going. These cashew trees will grow with you. They'll bear fruit, give shade, stand tall, just like you." From that day on, the boys cared for those plants as if they were part of themselves. They watered them tenderly, protected them from the roosters, and sat beside them whenever they wanted silence. Slowly, the cashew trees began to sprout, and with them, a new understanding began to grow too. They didn't have a mother like the others, but they had a story. They had gestures. They had Joe. And Joe, even with a heart marked by unanswered questions, knew he had planted something stronger than pain. he had planted belonging Dot in the village. Few understood the gesture. Some thought it strange, others laughed. But Dandara, who passed by from time to time, stopped, looked at the growing sprouts, and simply said, "Roots are a serious thing, especially when they're born from tears." Then she walked on as she always did, leaving behind another truth spoken, softly. The boys' question never returned in the same way. They still looked with curiosity at the other children and their mothers, but they carried in their hearts something many didn't have. The certainty that even without explanation, they were loved. Dot and love, when planted with truth, grows. Even in hard soil, even in a forgotten backyard, even in the heart of an old fisherman who only wanted to live in peace and ended up becoming the harbor for two lives, left behind by the river. The sharpest words don't always come in a shout. Sometimes they're tossed carelessly, mixed with fake laughter, spat out in the middle of a casual conversation, like ashes thrown into the wind without a thought of where they'll land. That's how the truth, or what was left of it, reached the twins' ears. Not through Joe's choice, nor by fate's will, but through the bitter tongue of a neighbor who always preferred to wound rather than heal. It was laundry day. By the river, the women were all there, slapping clothes on the rocks, laughing loudly, whispering even louder. Solano and Zaya, now old enough to help, had accompanied Joe to gather firewood, but wandered off, curious when they heard the beating of drums and chatter. From the washerwomen, they sat behind a bush, spying, just like boys do before they realize the world can be too cruel, for eyes still so young. Between one laugh and another, a silly argument broke out. One woman talked about another's daughter. The other snapped back. And in the heat of the squabble, one of them, angry and shonged, pointed to the boys hiding behind the bush and said, "Loud enough for all to hear, and you want to talk about my daughter. But forget, those two were thrown in the river like rotten fish." Silence. A silence that screamed louder than the insult. The others stopped. Some looked down. Others tried to change the subject, but the damage was done. The words had already flown, and Solano and Zaya heard everything. Their bodies stiffened. Their still small hearts pounded with a force they didn't know how to name. Thrown in the river, rotten fish. The phrase echoed like a hammer inside. Them. They ran home. They didn't cry. They didn't ask questions. They just fell silent, each in a corner, like the ground had cracked beneath their feet. Jew, seeing them like that, understood. No one needed to say anything. Only someone who's carried secrets knows when they've been revealed too soon. That night, Joe didn't sleep. He paced back and forth, breath trapped in his chest. He knew the time had come, but what words could explain something so cruel without adding more hurt? How do you translate a mother's despair without making it sound like she abandoned out of choice? He sat between them, both lying quietly in the hammock, eyes sunken, lost. "I heard," said Solano, his voice low. "Nearly gone. Were we thrown away?" "Like rotten fish?" Zaya asked with a look Jew had never seen in either of them. Joey adjusted himself like someone about to lift a heavy weight from deep within. "You weren't thrown away. You were returned to God so he could choose your father." The boy stayed silent sometimes. When we're born, the world isn't ready for us. Sometimes the one who brings us into the world has no ground to stand on. But that's, never your fault. Never. Solano bit his lip. Zaya blinked hard, holding back tears. But Joe went on. "Yes, I found you between the rocks. But I didn't see garbage. I saw life. I saw promise. And every step you've taken since then proves that destiny isn't something to be thrown away. It's something to be transformed." The boys looked at each other, and for the first time since hearing those words at the river, they took a deep breath. They weren't ready to forgive or to fully understand. But there was truth in Joe's eyes. And truth, when spoken with love, plants healing, even if it takes time to bloom. Dot. The next morning, Joe went to the yard and swept with force. It wasn't dirt he wanted to clear. It was the hurt the village had spread. Then he looked over at the cashew trees planted long ago. Their leaves were strong now, branches straight with the promise of fruit. Just like the boys, the gossiping neighbor never apologized. But from then on, when she saw the twins pass by, she lowered her eyes. And the boys, they never asked about that phrase again. They kept the pain like a stone at the bottom of the river, but they used its weight to keep. Their feet grounded because they had learned early on that some truths hurt, but they also freed. And even the harshest words, when faced with dignity, become roots. And roots, as Jew taught them, don't need explanation. They just need care and time. Jew's yard had always been simple, hard-packed dirt, a wooden bench leaning against the cashew tree, a few chickens wandering around, and the ever-present smell of firewood smoke. But that morning, it became a stage with no music, no dancers, only an old fisherman, two boys with tear-airy eyes, and an entire village listening closely to what wasn't being said. After the incident by the river, the gossip had spread with even more force. What had once been a murmur had become a declaration. Everyone now knew or thought they knew that the twins had been abandoned, set adrift in straw baskets like someone tossing garbage on the roadside. And as always happens when truth arrives, incomplete, it becomes a weapon. Children whispered at the Ville's makeshift school. Adults circled around the story, letting poison slip out in crooked phrases. And even without saying names, all fingers pointed in the same direction. Joe Solano and Zayadat. Joe knew silence could no longer shelter them. What had once been protection now weighed on the boys' backs like a stone. It was time to speak. Not in defense, but for justice. That morning, he woke before the sun. He swept the yard slowly like someone preparing sacred ground, put on his best shirt, though afraid at the shoulders, combed his hair with water, and rubbed andu oil into Hizdri hands. Then he called the boys, who understood by his look that this day would be different. He told them to sit on the bench under the cashew tree. He stood in front of the house and waited for the village to stir. One by one, the curious began to arrive. First, the women heading to the well. Then the men with tools in hand. Soon, a small crowd had formed in front of Joe's yard. "You going to talk, Joe?" someone asked, half laughing, half marking. He nodded, looked at them all, eyes steady, without resentment, and said, "These boys right here weren't rejected. They were returned to God so he could choose their father." A deep silence fell. Even the birds seemed to hush. Joa went on, "When I found them in the river, I didn't see shame. I saw a promise. I saw life asking for shelter. And since that day, all I've done is care with little with faith. With truth, a woman, once among the worst gossips, lowered her gaze. One of the men who used to mock Jew scratched his neck, unable to meet his eyes. Joe took a deep breath. He was old, tired, but his voice came with the strength of someone carrying truth on his back. Those who don't understand what it means to raise a child you didn't give birth to will never understand what it means to love without expecting anything in return. But I do, and so do they, because these two have taught me more than I ever imagined." Zca, eyes shining, held his brother's hand. Solano squeezed it as if to say, "We're in this together." That week, the village's silence turned into respect. No one spoke of the boys the same way again. On the contrary, when the night of the story circle came, a tradition held each full moon. The elders gathered to choose who would share a tale that time. And for the first time, the chosen storytellers were two boys, Solano and Zaya. That night, seated around the fire with everyone watching, the two told their story. But they told it without bitterness, without shame. They told it with the steadiness of those who've walked through pain, but were not defined by it. "We were born from a woman's womb," said Solano. "But it was in a fisherman's arms that we learned what it means to be sons," Zeka added, "and the river that so many think only takes brought us back that day, brought us home." The applause was hesitant at first, but it grew. And that night, it wasn't just the boys who were honored. Ju, too. The old fisherman, once the butt of jokes, became a symbol of courage and fatherhood. Dandara, present, as always, nodded and murmured more to herself than to anyone else. Words have power, but when spoken with truth, they heal even what time could not. The village understood. Not everyone said it. Not everyone apologized. But everyone fell silent. And in that silence, there was more respect than any word could offer. And the twins, they kept going. Not as victims, but as living proof that destiny isn't chosen, but it can be rewritten, especially when love is the pencil and dignity the paper. Time marched with long, steady strides through the village. The cashew trees now cast their shade. The boys grew strong, and Joe carried a lighter heart, like a man who knew he had fulfilled something greater than himself. Solano and helped in the fields, fixed tools, fetched water, and left a trail of respect wherever they went. They had names, they had roots, they had a story not told by tragedy, but by dignity. But far from there, in a forgotten corner of the world, someone still carried the part of the story Noon could see. The mother, the woman who once set her children afloat on the river, hadn't vanished from the map. She'd vanished from herself. She went from house to house, surviving off scraps and favors, walking with her face covered and her heart exposed. Every time she saw a child, an old pain pulsed in her chest. Every time she saw twins, time stopped for seconds that felt like hours. The nights were the worst. She dreamed of floating baskets, of Thriver speaking, of the boys calling a name she no longer knew if she deserved. She told herself she had no choice, that hunger, loneliness, and abandonment had spoken louder. But deep down she knew guilt was a scar not even time dared to touch. It was on a cloudy morning that she woke with a different weight. Herbity no longer obeyed as before. A stubborn cough, bone-deep exhaustion, a fever that came and went. She knew what it was. Didn't need a healer to understand that the end was near. And with that, only one desire remained, to see her sons, not for forgiveness, not for explanation, just to see. To see with her own eyes what years of regret had sculpted inside her. She gathered what little she had, wrapped herself in the same old scarf, now more worn, more sorrowful, and set out. Her legs ached, her steps were slow, but her heart pushed her forward. She knew she'd be watched, judged, but none of that mattered anymore. What weighed more was everything left unsaid, undone. UNLIVED. She arrived at the village by dusk. The sky burned with the colors of fire as if announcing something sacred. She stood at the edge of the village, took a deep breath, and searched for the simple house with the cashew trees beside it. It was there, just as she remembered. But more, alive, fuller, sacred. She approached slowly. The scarf on her face hid the shame, but not the pain. She stopped at the gate. She didn't enter, didn't call, just stood there looking at the cashew. Trees like facing two grown children standing tall. Joe, coming out of the house with a bucket of water, saw her. He didn't recognize her at first, but his eyes, trained to see beyond clothes, beyond dust, beyond time, soon understood she was there. The mother, they stared at each other for long seconds. No gesture, no questions, just the weight of an entire story between them. She was the first to speak, her voice rough, weakened, heavy with a pain no remedy could heal. "I came to ask, not for me, but for them. Let me see. Just see before it's too late." Joe didn't answer with words. He turned, went inside, and minutes later returned. He opened the gate slowly, without ceremony, without promise, walked ahead, and she, like a shadow, followed. The boys were sitting on the ground, helping sort seeds, laughing together. When they heard footsteps, they looked up. Joe stopped a few meters away, looked at the woman. She hesitated. Her legs trembled, her eyes filled with tears, but she took. One step, then another. Solano noticed first. Zaya stayed silent. Time stood still, and then the woman fell to her knees, her face still covered, and said, "Only forgive me. I only learned how to be a mother when it was already too late." Joe Bo didn't move a muscle. He let the moment speak. No explanations, no justifications, because some things can only be translated by time and love. And there she remained, the mother on her knees, weak, ill, but with her eyes on her sons, and the boys standing before a mystery they had only ever known through Joe's silences. The request had been made. The pain laid bare. The village curious watched from a distance, but there in that yard no one shouted, no one judged. Only hearts beat for all of them. And once again, destiny proved that no matter how far we run, truth always finds its way back. Even if it's late, even if it comes with fear, even if it's just to ask Dot for one last look, the whole village knew within hours, as it happens in small towns where news runs faster than the wind. Everyone was whispering about the woman's return, the boy's mother, Theone, who left, the one who ran, the one who came back. Some whispered with anger, others with pity. There were those who said it was too late, that what's done cannot be undone. But between the gossip and the judgment, there were also those who stayed silent because they knew some pains don't need to be dissected. They need to be embraced. At Zhao's house, time felt suspended. The woman slept in a corner of the porch covered, with a clean cloth offered by Zaya. The fever came and went. Her body was made of bones and regret. Joan brewed teas, and Dandara quietly called a ride with roots and silence. She ran her hand along the woman's back, murmuring prayers, as if stitching together the spirit of someone who no longer knew where she belonged in the world. Solano and Zika didn't ask, didn't demand, didn't run. They stayed present, their eyes searching for meaning, but their hearts, for reasons even they couldn't name, already knew. They were facing something bigger than any explanation. 3 days passed like that. On the morning of the 4th, the woman stood weak, leaning on the wall. She walked to the yard where the boys were sitting beneath the cashew tree. They saw her but didn't stand. She stopped a few steps away, removed the scarf from her head. For the first time, she revealed her face. The marks of time were there. The weariness, the guilt, the long road, but also a hidden tenderness in her eyes. Something that can't be explained, only recognized. She tried to speak, but no voice came. Only her eyes spoke, and they said everything that years of absence could never hide. That's when Solano stood. He walked toward her with slow, steady steps, stopped in front of the woman, observed her for a moment, and with the simplicity that only pure souls carry, said, "You smell like something old, but you seem kind." And he hugged her. Zeka's eyes filled. With tears followed. He joined his brother in the embrace. The woman broke. Her knees gave in. The tears flowed in silence, soaking her son's shoulders. There was no shouting, no apologies, just the muffled sound of a heart being cleansed from the inside out. Jobo watched from the porch. Dandara smiled gently like someone seeing a prayer, answered without a word, and the village. Ah, the village. The neighbors peeked through window cracks. The men paused mid-step. The children fell quiet in their games. Noon fully understood what happened in that embrace, but everyone felt it because there was a power there that logic can't explain. Something ancestral, like rain falling at the right time, like the sun returning after days of darkness. In that embrace, there was no spoken forgiveness, but there was reconciliation. No promises, but there was presence. No justifications, but there was surrender. After that, no one spoke of the mother the same way again. They still called her that, woman. But now without venom in their voices she was seen helping around the house, sweeping the yard, cooking quietly. She never asked for recognition, and the boys never asked for explanations. What existed between them was another kind of bond built not on what had been done, but on what could still be lived. The cashew tree grew strong, and in that yard, where once there were only questions, now there was something you couldn't quite name but could feel. A beginning, a gesture, a choice. And those who saw that embrace never forgot it. Because it wasn't just a meeting of bodies, it was proof that even with all its flaws, love can still have the last word. Even when it comes late, even when it comes broken, still it comes and it heals. Life, no matter how quiet it seems, always saves a last word. And sometimes it doesn't come with applause, nor with punishment, but with a warm kind of justice. The kind that doesn't shout, but burns gently. From the inside, in the village. After the embrace, after the reunion, the routine seemed to find a new rhythm. The mother remained there, discreet, hunched, living between guilt and relief. The boys welcomed her with the natural grace of those who understand. Deep down, that love can't be forced. It's built even if it comes late. Joe remained steady, watching from a distance, caring for all three with the same quiet devotion he always had. Solano and Zaya, now teenagers, worked the fields, taught the younger kids to read, and spent hours under the cashew tree, which now bore large, sweet fruit, like a promise finally fulfilled. Then, on a hot, overcast afternoon, a stranger appeared. He rode in on a skinny donkey, his clothes to clean for someone who truly knew the land, eyes wary, but filled with something Joe recognized immediately. Interest, he stopped at the edge of the village and asked for Jew, the fisherman. They pointed him in the right direction. When he arrived, he got off the donkey like a man who carried little in his hands, but a lot on his shoulders. He looked at the house, the yard, the boys in the distance, and, without asking permission, announced, "I came to claim my sons." The phrase dropped like a stone in the middle of the silence. Jobo, trimming branches with a worn machete, slowly raised his eyes. He didn't move, just stared at the man. And right then, without a single word, he knew that it was him, the man who had abandoned their mother, who vanished into the world without even knowing if his sons had taken their first breath. Now standing before them, speaking of recognition, the mother, hearing the voice, came from the kitchen with a cloth in their hands. When she saw him, the blood drained from her face. Her body trembled, but she said nothing. She turned around and went back inside like someone backing away from a fire they've already been burned by. The man tried to explain. "I was young. I didn't know what to do. Yes, I left, but now I'm ready. I want the boys with me. They're my blood." Jobo took a deep breath. Didn't say yes, didn't say no. He just stepped aside and called the boys with a simple gesture. They came serious, attentive. "This man says he's your father. He wants to talk to you." Zeka looked at Solano. Solano looked at Zika. There was no anger in their eyes, only clarity. The man tried to smile, opened his arms, and said, "My sons, you've grown so much." Solano stepped forward, stood in front of the man, and replied with the calm of someone carrying more wisdom than his years. "We were fished, not caught." Zek followed firm. "A father isn't someone who shows up when everything's ready. It's the one who stays when everything's missing," and they turned their backs. The man stood frozen, arms still outstretched, but the gesture died in the air. Neither boy looked back. They didn't need to. What they had to say had already, Ben said. Not with shouting, with dignity. Joe went back to trimming branches. The mother from inside wept softly, not from sorrow, but from relief. For the first time she understood there was something in her son's silence she could never repay. Belonging, the man left, mounted his donkey, and departed the same way he came without leaving a trace of longing. Dot. The village didn't ask, didn't mock, they just watched and learned another lesson. Life was teaching clearly, even without words. That night, the boys returned to the cashew tree. They ate a fruit, tossed the seeds to the earth, and laughed, not out of spite, but out of freedom. Because there, in that yard that once held 2 tears-soaked baskets, there were now roots, history, and truth. The man who fathered them arrived too late, and time, that healer of all things, also knows how to respond without lifting a hand. Justice isn't revenge. It's silence with weight. It's answers delivered gently. It's love that doesn't sell itself to the first gesture. And in that village, no one ever again dared to ask whose children they were, because everyone knew they belonged. To their river, to Joe, to the cashew tree, and most of all, to themselves. The years passed like the waters of the river, where everything began, silent but steady. The boys grew up, became men of calm words, steady hands, and wide hearts. They didn't walk the path of bitterness, nor built their lives atop the hollow of their origin. Quite the opposite. They built upon presence, upon action, upon the words Joe always repeated, "Root is not where you were born, it's where you choose to stay." With that thought in mind, they decided to transform the yard of their home, where they once played with mud and dry leaves, into a place of learning. They opened a school not with new chalkboards or imported desks, but with wooden benches, strong clay walls, and the same cashew tree in the center, now bearing fruit that fed more than hunger at that school. No one asked where a student came from. It didn't matter if they were the child of a single mother, an orphan, or if their father lived across the world. What mattered was what each child carried in their gaze: the thirst to learn, the courage to dream, the will to not repeat the pain of adults. Joe, now aged, walked slower, but he was always there. He'd sit beneath the shade of the cashew tree, tell stories, teach how to make a hook from wire, how to fish with patience. He was known as Tatajal by all, even by those who had fathers of blood, because what he offered couldn't be bought. It was example. It was root, the mother, the one who once fled from her own reflection, now stayed in silence. She never asked for titles, never demanded a place. She simply helped. She swept the yard, served lunch, mended patched clothes, smiled with her eyes. She never again said "my sons" out loud, but she cared for them as if every meal she served were a prayer asking for forgiveness. Time as always reshaped everything. When her illness returned and her body could no longer hold on, the whole village paused. It wasn't a grand funeral, but it was full of truth. Solano and Zechadug, the grave, with their own hands beside the cashew tree. They made a simple cross from weathered wood, and Joe, his voice trembling, read the words they had written. Together, here lies someone who once failed, but chose to love again. The phrase wasn't meant to impress, it was meant to recognize, because that woman who once released 2 tiny bodies into the river ended her life by offering the village an act of bravery. She stayed without excuse. Even in shame, she remained and loving after the fall. That is the hardest kind of love. After the burial there was silence, but not the heavy kind. A silence of respect, like when the earth thanks the rain. The village at last understood. Not every surrender is abandonment. Sometimes it's the despair of someone who no longer has anyone to ask, and those who welcome that despair reborn with it, by it, through it. And the twins, they kept teaching, kept caring, kept being what Joe had always been, a refuge. Because they grew up hearing that destiny isn't changed with anger, it's changed with presence. And that sometimes the greatest miracles don't fall from the sky. They rise from the dirt, from the mistake, from the decision to begin again. The river still flows in the same direction. But the village, after those two boys, learned to see it differently. They learned that every basket carries within it a story that, if welcomed with love, can turn the current into a path. And there beneath, the deep roots of the cashew trees, something grew, something not even time nor pain nor judgment could uproot. The certainty that when love finds courage, no abandonment is final, and no miracle is ever just a coincidence. If this story touched your heart, let us know where you're watching from. Leave a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to the channel. That really helps us keep bringing you real and emotional stories like this one. Thank you for being part of our